From Texas, Mr. Babin is recognized.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses as well. Mr. Nordhaus, it is unrealistic to assume that we will be able to rely on renewable energy like wind and solar in the near future for all of our energy needs. Is that a true or false statement?
That would be my view.
Okay. How do we decide when it's time to reduce wind and solar subsidies to allow the market to take over?
I think that with mature wind and solar technologies, which is mostly what we're subsidizing now, there is general agreement, including among proponents of those technologies, that they are competitive in many contexts with fossil fuel technologies. I think we're probably at the point where we ought to put that proposition to the test and scale back subsidies. Now, I do think that there are probably a range of advanced renewable technologies that we may want to continue to provide some support for. But when you're looking at cheap solar, 15% efficiency solar panels that are being mass-produced in China, I'm not quite sure why we're paying substantially continuing to subsidize them.
I got you, and I agree with you 100%.
I'd be happy to add a comment on that if I may.
Well, I'm not through just yet. We had the Department of Energy Secretary here just last week, and we brought out the fact that some federal agencies had formally been articulating and reporting on the amount of subsidies for solar versus fossil fuel versus wind, et cetera. And it was astounding to see just a few years ago, like 4 years ago, that we were spending something like 15 times more subsidizing solar than we were, say, fossil fuels. In fact, even 100 times in some cases. And all of a sudden, this agency that was reporting this went silent. We're not able to see those reports over the last few years, and we don't know whether they don't want the public to see these huge discrepancies or what the reason is. But the Secretary Perry said that he was going to look into this and start printing these reports out again. Thank you. Why is it important, Mr. Nordhaus, that the U.S. not stand in the way of developing countries' efforts to build and improve infrastructure, even if it means more fossil fuel consumption?
Well, as I noted earlier, when it comes to infrastructure, that's what makes us adaptable and resilient to a changing climate and to just existing climate extremes. So if you're concerned about the impacts of climate change on poor populations in the developing world, the most important thing that they can do, certainly over the next couple of decades, is build infrastructure. And right now, a lot of that infrastructure still requires fossil fuels. So we should be clear-eyed about the trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation in those particular contexts.
Thank you. And Mr. Cass, in your testimony, you mentioned that the Mills study included an alternative analysis from its main findings that excluded human adaptive response to temperatures. Do most temperature studies that you have analyzed come with such a disclaimer to the public that human ability to adapt is not considered a factor?
Usually the study itself will state that, and I would say fairly clearly. If you go and find the original report and read it, you can understand what they're doing. I think the problem is that by the time it gets summarized up to the GAO summary to policymakers, certainly by the time it gets reported in the newspaper, that kind of context is either lost entirely or put down at the bottom, when in fact it's the very heart of the issue.
Okay, and then also, back to you, Mr. Nordhaus, you testified that the U.S. carbon emissions are lower today than what would have been mandated by the Waxman-Markey legislation in 2009 that failed to pass Congress. What has been the primary driver in this reduction?
The biggest single driver has been the shale gas revolution, which I would note, is a classic example of the sort of public-private partnership to develop, commercialize cheap, scalable technology that we need a lot more of. I think that I will also note that once upon a time we thought of natural gas as a bridge fuel in the power sector from high carbon to low carbon intensity. I think when you look at the record, having looked at generation shares in the power sector over the last decade, I think there's a pretty strong case that natural gas is doing, mostly doing exactly that it has been displacing coal, and that in more recent years, a lot of natural gas generation has been displaced by wind, which is the second largest driver of falling emissions in the power sector.
And I can vouch for that because my home district of Southeast Texas had a brand new biomass plant meant to take wood products and convert them into electricity to be sold on the grid. And yet, with just a few short years later, this brand new plant is now sitting idle because of the cheap natural gas feedstocks that we have today. So anyway, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you.